Episode 86, in conversation with Ben, A Young Earth Creationist. I am going to start this episode the way I promised I would never introduce an episode, with an apology for technical issues. I consider it bad form, but sadly, Andrew and I suffered from audio issues during this recording. Some of this was due to a problematic internet connection, and some of this was down to the aged PC I have been recording on for the past 4 years. The latter is responsible for some of the background distortion that is detectable. I typically put a lot of effort into cleaning up audio on our episodes, and this one has beaten me. I've spent 5 times longer editing this episode than any other. I'm sorry. Some of the edits where I've gone very heavy on the cutting are much more obvious than I would like, and I have failed to eradicate some of the audio distortion. For that I am sorry too. I do this as an amateur in my free time, and making this audio perfect was well beyond my skill set. On a positive note, I am recording this intro on a brand new PC, which is what I shall be using for future recording and edits, and this should go some way to ensuring that this issue is never encountered again. If you find the audio distortion too much, please let me know at reasonpressed@gmail.com. The feedback will be helpful to me so I know what I can get away with and what I can't. With the embarrassing bit done, here is the conversation Andrew and I had with Ben. There are some additional audio inserts where I have done fact checking during the edit. The first at around 25 minutes in, and the last at around an hour and 25 minutes. There are also links in the show notes that are referenced in these notes. Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of Still Unbelievable. This is Matthew and Andrew. We've done a couple of shows on the trot together. How did we do that?
Hey kids, I'm not sure how we managed to get that done, Matthew, but we're actually going to do 2 in a row. So good to be back in the chair this time around and looking forward to speaking with our guest.
Excellent, yes. And speaking of guests, we do have a guest. We have a guest, Ben. Now, Ben, I know from the Unbelievable Facebook group. Thank you for joining us, Ben. Now, the reason why Ben is with us is the current episode that's live is episode 80, which is one of me critiquing Joel Settercase on why he should be a yak, and so I put not in brackets and say why I should not be a yak. And so I critique Joel Settercase's episodes, and I put that up on the Unbelievable group. And knowing that there are some Young Earth Creationists in that group, I put an invite as part of my comment. If there is anybody who would like a conversation, feel free and we'll have one. And literally the next day, I had a positive response from Ben. Ben has his own podcast. I'll let you tell him about that in a minute. Andrew and I have listened to most of his episodes. It's relatively new. Ben, welcome to the show. Thank you for accepting the invitation. We've had a good chat before coming on there. I'm pretty sure we can have a pleasant conversation, even though we don't agree about quite a lot of things, but we'll get there. Tell us about yourself.
All right, well, my name's Ben Kissling, and I go by the pseudonym Macrophage for the podcast, but the podcast is called Macrophage Strategy. I haven't done an episode for a few months because I got sick, so I'm working on a new episode, but hopefully every couple of weeks I'll have a new one out for the foreseeable future. But I grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska, and I grew up as a young earth creationist. My dad was really big into it. And I got into intelligent design theory also in high school in the late 90s. Went to school to study biochemistry, and I have been working in laboratories since then. And I'm currently a master's student at Biola University in their Master of Arts of Science and Religion program. So I've been very interested in this issue of science and faith for quite a long time. And I'm excited to talk to you guys about it.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that'll be quite interesting because I always say that it was science that got me out of faith. So that will be interesting to see where we can reach some understanding on that point there. On a point of your podcast, actually, I just want to compliment you on your first episode, the one I listened to, where you talked about people leaving the church. And you said something that I haven't heard many Christians acknowledge. So I wanted to acknowledge your acknowledgement of that. I'm going to get into deep trouble in a minute, aren't I? What you said was, you said something along the lines of, maybe the reason why people are leaving the church is not because they need more apologetics and more evangelism, Maybe the reason is they're finding church unattractive, and maybe the problem is inside the church and what the church is doing, and the church needs to change that. That was what I took away from what you said, and I wanted to be sure that I understood properly what it was you were saying, because I don't hear that kind of admission from Christians very often.
That's basically what I said. You know, I grew up with a lot of apologetic instruction, so I don't say that apologetic instruction is bad. It's definitely something that you should do as a Christian parent today, because you won't get it anywhere else. You won't get it at school. You won't even get it at Christian schools a lot of the time. I found out. I went to a Christian high school. I think what I was trying to focus on more there is a emphasis in the American church, the evangelical church, it's even in the name, on evangelism of non-believers. And I was simply pointing out that the biggest problem the American church has right now is not our ability to convert non-believers to Christianity. The biggest problem we have is people who grew up Christian and are leaving the church. And I think that's becoming more widely recognized. And as to why that is the case, I have some thoughts on that are probably more than what you want to hear, but I do think sometimes apologists make arguments that are not great and are designed to persuade instead of be seeking truth. And that, I think, is a problem. I want to steer away from that. And that's why I'm comfortable talking with you guys, and why I told you that I'm not going to try to convert you, because that's not my focus. I love talking with people of different points of view, because it helps me to criticize my own views and help me find things I might be wrong about or whatever. But my focus as sort of a, I guess, public figure, not really, but is more along the lines of teaching Christians to believe in Christianity rather than non-Christians.
The reason why I bring it up is I think it's a credit to you that you said that, because I've been deconverted, whatever phrase you want to use, for 15 years now. I'm quite bored of the number of Christians who have said to me, oh, you didn't read the right thing, or give me a list of books. You need to read these books, or something equivalent, or read this link, or watch this YouTube video. That will fix you. Invariably, it's something that I've already processed or already gone through from another source somewhere else. It's not new information to me. And this kind of pepper spraying of information, of bullet points, that if you just read these the way I've read them, you'll be reconverted. It is simply a non-productive process for any Christian to take with me. And so hearing you say what you said, for me, genuinely was a breath of fresh air, because I hear it so rarely. And that's really why I brought it up. It was really nice to hear. It immediately warmed me to you as an individual. It immediately warmed me to your podcast. It immediately made me want to listen to the rest of your podcast. Regardless of what we agree or disagree on, that fact alone that you acknowledged is a credit to you. And I think that there are more Christians that ought to take that road.
Well, thanks. That's very nice of you to say. I grew up in the evangelical church as a very smart, intellectually oriented person, and there's a lot that passes for argument that isn't very good. And I've noticed that a lot of that kind of argument is often based on reasoning, well, this argument works for evangelism.
Yeah.
And I've just come to have an antipathy towards that style of argument, because anybody can be persuaded by anything. People are different. It's not a legitimate argument to say that because this argument or this claim or this piece of evidence persuaded someone somewhere sometime, that means that therefore it's correct and true and rational and all the rest. And you run into that kind of argument all the time. And the classic example that I like to give was during the Iraq War. There was a debate among people that I knew about whether it was right for George W. Bush to go to war in Iraq, because the one side says, well, if we go to war in Iraq, we'll open Iraq up to Christian evangelism. And then the other side says, yeah, but if we support this war, we'll be supporting a bad war and it'll make Christianity look bad, right? The thing is both sides could be right, but it doesn't matter, right? Because what persuades somebody of one thing might persuade someone else of another thing. You know, my view is that people have free will and they have the ability to choose. And so when someone is not a Christian, my instinct is that the person made a choice at some point. It's not that they were forced or compelled to their position by an argument or evidence. That's my view on it. But I don't know. What do you think, as someone who has deconverted, do you think there was an argument? You mentioned science deconverted you, maybe?
Let me start with the Iraq war just for a moment, because something there sounded odd to me. When we go to war as a country, hopefully we go for some reason better than we will or won't bring Christianity to them. I hope as a nation that we have better interest than that in mind. Now, I realize that being for you, there may not be a better possible interest, right? From the Christian perspective, there are souls on the line or whatever. When we decided to go to war after 9/11, if everyone remembers, the public reason had to do with weapons of mass destruction. It wasn't a Christian consideration. Do we take Christianity to Iraq or not? And it seems very strange to me to say, oh, well, we're going to take Christianity by way of war. It's very jarring to me as a non-Christian. You're welcome to come back on this if you want, but it rings peculiarly to me.
Well, I think that debate occurred in the context of people who were post ad hoc rationalizing why they supported it. So I don't think that was, at least not that I know of, a reason for supporting it initially. These are just conversations that random people have. I don't think that was an actual reason why we went to the war there. We probably don't want to get into this too much, but maybe a better example to use would be an argument over whether or not a Christian should go to a bar. And I've heard this argument before as well, and it's a similar structure. The non-believers are at the bar. We have to go to the bar to connect with non-believers and evangelize them. And then the other person will come back and say, no, you shouldn't go to the bar because that tarnishes the name of Christ. If you're a Christian and goes to the bar, that is tarnishing Christianity because bars are associated with sinful behavior. And that will make Christianity look bad to the world, which will also hurt our evangelistic effort. And so evangelism is not a standard for truth. And what I'm trying to push back on is there should be higher standards for truth than arguing, as I've heard some apologists argue quite often, that, well, we have to take this position because this is the best position for interacting with non-believers and bringing non-believers to Christianity. That's all I'm trying to say.
That's interesting because that actually moves nicely into the last bit that you and Matthew were talking about, which is what might have led me or Matthew out. Was there something that started us on the road to leaving Christianity? And for me, it was actually the idea of truth. I've told Still Unbelievable listeners this in the past. I don't know if you've heard it through any of the podcasts that you've listened to, but I was a big believer in capital T truth.
Mm-hmm.
You shall know the truth. The truth shall set you free. Sanctify them through your truth. Thy word is true. I eventually felt very different about the idea of truth. And in your second podcast, I think we'll probably find some room for disagreement here, because it sounded to me like, not putting words in your mouth, but it sounded to me like you believe in a notion of truth that I no longer support. So I think truth is probably a process of successive approximation, that whatever truth is, it is very often a thing that we have to grapple with and approximate and approximate and approximate over and over and over again. And whenever we think that we've gotten to a place where we know the truth, capital T truth, very often I find it to be some sort of proposition that can't be disconfirmed. And if you're offering a proposition that has no method of disconfirmation, you're not actually talking about truth. You're just talking about conviction.
I guess it's my turn to answer your question. I'm going to go against what you've some of the things you've just been saying, Ben, about choice and free will and being compelled. because the evidence compelled me. I had no choice but to follow. I'm very much in the camp of free will is something that works for us to pretend that we have, but it doesn't exist really. And my whole road into deconstruction and questioning the fundamentals of my Christianity came from an evidence position. It started with evolution and learning more about evolution and accepting evolution. There are multiple key moments in it, and probably one of the big key moments during that process was around about 2003, a visit to the United States. Spent a couple of days around the Grand Canyon. My wife and I spent a whole day along the south edge of the Grand Canyon. We visited multiple points. And I was at the point in my deconstruction where old Earth versus young Earth had become really critical in my mind. So this day that we spent at various points along the south edge of the Grand Canyon, I just stood there and looked. And I looked at the vastness of that, and I looked at all the rock layers that I could see, and I looked at all the erosion lines that I could see from the rivers, and I could see where edges had collapsed into a mound, and some collapsed edges were significantly older than others, so they didn't all happen at the same time, and some collapsed edges had been further eroded away, and then another collapse on them, and you could see all this history just standing on the edge and look at it. And I just looked at it and I was just working through my mind, how could this work? If it's a young Earth and this came from a flood, how would it work? How would my mind work it? And would those rough edges be rough or would they be smooth? And then I thought about it over a long age, and if that river which distanced you up, it looks like a tiny little stream. And that and all the years, and it would have required millions of years, eroding away and gently going through that rock and those layers, would that more likely explain the features that I see in front of me? And I decided it was the latter. So by the end of that week, literally what I'd been looking at and the questions I'd been asking myself and the evidence that to the best of my ability, I'd been able to look at, I felt that I had no choice. And that was where my young Earth creationism died its last gasp. And I absolutely used the phrase that it was the evidence that compelled me. I had no choice.
Going back to what Andrew said about truth with a capital T, something that you said, Matthew, in the first sentence, I think, is you said there's not actually free will, but we sort of act as though it exists.
Yes, along those lines, yeah.
Yeah, so I think there is a capital T truth, but what Andrew was saying about how we know truth is a very different thing, right? And trying to come to closer and closer approximations of truth is a good description of, I think, human knowledge. So I think there can be an absolute truth, and we can believe in it metaphysically, and also accept epistemologically that we're never going to get all of it exactly right. Is that something you would agree with?
That's a tough one for me, because there's certainly an emotional appeal to just thinking that there's an absolute truth out there. I don't know what could possibly qualify as absolute truth. The only way I know about truth is that it gets tested and matches or fails some set of criteria, right? So it's true or false based on its testing. And so if you're talking about an absolute truth, it sounds to me like you're saying there's something that can't be tested. So am I wrong in hearing you there?
I think absolute truth is the concept of what is true regardless of what we think about it.
So it can't be tested.
That doesn't relate to testability. It could or it might or might not be testable. But
how would we test it without thinking about it?
So I'm unsure. So if we're going to talk about ethical truths, I'm actually probably closer to your view than most Christians are, because I'm what's called a theological voluntarist. That's right in line with what you said, which it means that there could have been an alternate possible universe where God made morality different than it is here. Mm-hmm. Okay, that would be then God's choice, his free choice to make different moral systems, and he just chose to make this one, the one that we live under, right? And so I track with you a lot on that. There was something you said in your previous comment about how you can't get to any foundational truth that is not. You didn't use this word, but I think you mean a presupposition, right?
Ethically, I think we have to be able to test our presuppositions, and it's when we stop being willing to test our presuppositions that we leave the ground of truth and just enter the ground of conviction. I'm right because I think it.
Okay, if we're doing an iterated prisoner's dilemma type situation, at the sort of ontological metaphysical level, each player has to be self-interested in order for it to work, correct? They have to, when you do that kind of study, you assume rational, and this is, I'm talking about computer models usually. You have to assume rational self-interest of each player. If you make a player who is not rationally self-interested, you can easily mess up the whole theory. So for example, there was a competition for the best player of an iterated prisoner's dilemma situation, and they've done it at least twice, I think, but I think it was the last time the team that won entered like 60 different programs. And what they did is they programmed most of their entrants to recognize a code of plays from a smaller number of their entrants. And then when they recognized that code of plays, they would then switch to always defect, meaning they would always defect in the move. And then the one that had been designed to be the winner would always, or I'm sorry, it's the other way around. The ones they designed to be losers would always cooperate, and the ones designed to be winners would always defect. And that led to the small number of programs that they entered to be the winners to have a much higher score than they would otherwise have if they use a typical tit for tat strategy. So you have to assume certain values, and what they did is they, and they won far and away. Like they were the top 3 or 4 programs in the competition. And so what they did is they changed the basic values of a large number of programs that they entered into the competition, and said these are no longer rationally self-interested programs. They're going to give up their own self-interest for the good of a smaller number of other programs that were designed to be the winners. And so even in that sort of situation, you can see why basic values are essentially a choice, is what I'm arguing. That so, it's the whole Star Trek thing, the good of the many outweighs the good of the few or the one. They just turned it around and said the good of the few, the ones we want to win the competition, outweigh the good of the many other of the entrants that we put into the competition just to feed into the winners, right? And so in regards to human flourishing, the question that I would want to ask there is why should humans flourish? There are people who don't think that humans should flourish. There's a biology professor, I believe he's still at the University of Texas in Austin, named Eric Pianka, who several years ago, he said publicly that he thinks it would be a great idea if 90% of the human race was wiped out by an Ebola type virus. And he received applause for that. And he's literally worse than Thanos, right? Thanos only wanted to kill half of everybody, right?
This is Matthew jumping in on the edit because this point is important. See links 2, 3 and 4 in the show notes for details about Eric Pianka and the speech that Ben is referring to. What Pianka actually said is that humans have become too populous and that this will doom us. Human population density has become such that unless we find a way of managing our population, microbes will do it for us. He then went on to speculate how this might happen, counting out the HIV virus because it works too slowly, and suggesting that an Ebola type virus was more likely. He wasn't suggesting this was a good thing. He was saying that our arrogance has doomed humanity to this terrible fate. Many have misrepresented his words in the way that Ben has just repeated. Those criticisms coming mainly from the political right and the religious. See link 5 for the Evolution News reporting on the article. The last 2 years of COVID pandemic should have been enough for those critics to see that the warning Pianka gave is real. He is also not the only one who has given this warning about human behaviour, and still many ignore it. This example of inaccurate, biased reporting is why we should always fact-check what we think others have said. The results of my fact-checking are that Pianka has been and continues to be gravely misquoted, especially by people who have an agenda to smear the consequences of atheism for their own gain. The real crime here is that Pianka's warning to humanity is not being given the seriousness that it deserves, and many will die unnecessarily as a result. To be clear, I'm not blaming Ben for this misrepresentation. Ben is merely repeating the words of those he trusts. Ben has been let down and lied to by people like the contributors to Evolution News. They are the ones at fault. They have wronged Pianka by their lies. They have wronged Ben by using their position of trust to spread that lie. Ben is the unwitting victim here. It's a shame that I was not aware of this particular untruth before Ben raised it, because I could have corrected him at the time.
If you recall, one of the things I said right up front was we do have to have agreement on outcome.
How do you get to an agreement on the outcome if you don't already have basic values, namely that human life is valuable and worth preserving?
Yeah, I think it sounds to me like what you're arguing is that we don't have some basic instincts. And so I think right away, we're probably going to be at cross purposes because you're arguing for a pure state where we don't have any sorts of instincts and self-interest built in. I don't think that's actually the way the board is set up. Human beings are social creatures. I was very careful to talk about things that seem to be built into us. Maybe you can argue that self-determination isn't built into us, but already in this show, you've argued for individual free will. So I think that's a losing proposition for you. We seem to have some interest beyond ourselves in our community. Now, I agree that we have people that don't have that same level of interest. And in fact, we do think of them as problematic in some way, right? We do have sociopathic people, but we can actually look at parts of the brain. We can see that the centers of the brain responsible for empathy are either damaged or smaller or less connected than they are in people who have, and I'll just say, normal empathy here as a placeholder for a deeper conversation. So I don't think that it's quite fair to say, oh, well, it's just a pure setup where we get to pick, and that pick is entirely random. There are as many bad pieces on the board as there are good pieces in the sense that for human flourishing. This appeal to the Christian notion of truth isn't the play you've made, but I think that's where this is ultimately going. Egalitarianism seems to be built in at some level. It doesn't seem to need a specific religious context to flourish.
Quick note, Andrew. Occasionally your audio is sounding just a little bit robotic. I don't know if there's anything you can do your end or if there's a signal issue you've got.
Oh, I'll look.
I think that you still need a very basic set of values, and the whole brain scan thing, there's the issue of, does our brain cause what we believe, or do what we choose to believe cause changes in our brain? I think that you still need a very basic value to say that human life is valuable. And I think that ultimately comes from Christianity in our society. It comes from the Imago Dei doctrine. I don't know where else it would come from, especially when we have examples of people who do reject that. And you would regard them as diseased, like there's something physically wrong with them, right? But why is it wrong? Why is their biological makeup incorrect, whereas quote unquote normal people have the correct biological makeup? I don't think we're going to get any further on that issue. But I think in the end, you'd have to end up saying that I'm diseased somehow because I disagree with you, right? Wouldn't you?
No, I certainly wouldn't
No,
say that. No, but
no.
I would reject the idea that it comes from Christian doctrine, because the whole point of Christian doctrine is it's something that it's taught to you, and it's only taught to a select number of people on the planet, whereas these are things that actually are part of our personality and part of our being before we get taught doctrines, and they are also in cultures which don't get exposed to Christianity. So I think the idea that it comes from Christianity is just provably false from the demographic we have around the world, and it's clearly something that's much more fundamental to our being. Therefore, it's got to come from our preferences, which come from what's built into our DNA.
Well, if it comes from something other than Christianity, it's clearly not capital T truth in the Christian sense, right? So if Christianity is the thing that actually gives it to us, then we shouldn't see it anywhere else.
Well, you might have a point in the sense that Christianity is only 2,000 years old. We could seg this into the sort of old age of the earth discussion, because the young earth position is that the Bible is the complete and accurate history of the world. And it shows, right, and it shows a God who is sovereign over all of humanity and over all of human history. And so this sort of basic egalitarianism, whatever precisely you mean by that, could just be a feature of how God created the human race, and that it persists even when there's a rejection of God as he's revealed himself.
Yeah.
That would be one argument I could maybe make, that young earth creationism is important to Christianity, is that it shows God as being sovereign over all of human history. Although there are old earth creationists who would hold that as well, so maybe that's not fair.
Matthew, you're welcome to move this along. I will say that it's interesting that Christianity has a notion of egalitarianism that they want people to follow, and that you don't need Christianity to have it. We'll have to see how we get on about God, because I think that is the next place it ultimately goes.
Ben, did you want to kick off with a couple of the questions that you had? That's probably a good way to move on this section.
Yeah, so I listened to episode 80 of your podcast. I noticed that you said some things where you indicated that young earth creationism is the most consistent position. That may not be the exact words, but... And then I went back and I listened to one of your older podcasts, and I found this quote, and I'll just read part of it here. You said, "I believe that young earth creationism is the purest and simplest interpretation of the Bible." And then just a few sentences later, you said, "I also agree with Ken Ham when he says that if you're going to introduce old earth or theistic evolution or anything that has the horrible word science connected to it, you undermine the authority of the Bible. I absolutely agree with that. Long may we be digging under the foundations of the Bible with science." So there may be some quibbles there. For example, I don't think Ken Ham would say the horrible word science, right?
Whoever said that was being very polemic. I'm going to claim credit for that, but it could have been Andrew
Right.
who
Okay.
said that. But it doesn't actually matter who said it, because I approve of it either way.
Yeah, so we would say we're also doing science. We would agree that if you go away from young earth creationism, it undermines the epistemic or epistemological case for the Bible and therefore for Christianity as a whole. Is that a correct representation of your position? And the follow-up I would want to ask is, which Christian position on science and faith issues and the biblical interpretation of Genesis and all the rest do you think is the best one, and why?
Okay, well, first of all, the first one, yes, because that episode that you quoted that from, it's several years old now. And I believe that's one that Andrew and I had David from the Graceful Atheists on, and we really did round up and hound on young earth creationism in that episode. My position hasn't really changed. So, yes, I do hold that in terms of the rawest and purest, I think that was a word that you used, that you quoted there, interpretation of the Bible is young earth creationism, because it requires the least amount of reinterpretation of what the words might mean or investigation into what the words might mean. So certainly I approve of that, because it's the simplest reading of the Bible.
Genesis chapter 1, well, Genesis 1 through Genesis 3, it's not written as if it is poetry. It's not written as allegory. It's not written as any other kind of speech other than a story to be taken literally.
The second part of the question was, what interpretation of Christianity do we think is the best?
In reference to the age of the earth and evolution and biblical interpretation and all of that.
Probably have to be theistic evolution, because I can't see a way in which I could let go of an old universe. I think that is pretty much settled now. I just don't see how we can get away from an old earth and an old universe. Ditto with evolution. I simply don't see how we could get away from the fact that all living organisms alive today eventually evolved from an original species at some point in the long distance past. So I don't see how either of those two things can be overturned scientifically. So it would have to be whatever interpretation of Christianity would fit with those, which I think would probably be theistic evolution.
Okay, so how would you reconcile that with what you said earlier, that young earth creationism is the best interpretation of Genesis, if you were a Christian?
It means that to be a Christian, you're now left with the point of you having to explain what some parts of the Bible actually are saying. So the most obvious thing to do is you would take the early chapters of Genesis, and probably a huge chunk of the Old Testament, as actually an amalgamation of origin stories, or stories of characters that have happened since origin and in no way whatsoever are reflective of any historical event. Something like Aesop's fables. They're fables that have been stitched together and they've been woven into a longer narrative, and the ability to be able to separate fact from fiction is just non-existent. So, but some of them are quite obviously fiction. So I just don't see how you could get away from that.
Okay, so would you argue that we have to take them as fiction, or that the author, or also, or not, that the ancient authors who actually wrote these texts wrote them knowing they were fiction and were understood to be fiction by the original audience?
I think it's more complex than that. I think they originally started as stories, and so they were probably originally stories that were literally told around the campfire. Some grandfather told a story that his grandfather had told him, and they evolved over many retellings, and when they eventually got to the point that they were written down, that's the point in which they became historical canon. But until that point, they were literally stories that parents told children as they were growing up, and they became part of the culture of storytelling. And those original tellers never for once thought that they were literally true, because they were aware that they were stories. But that history and that knowledge at some point got lost, and it probably got lost at the point that they were written down.
Okay. You would then say that originally they were intended as stories, but over time people began to believe they were true.
Yeah.
By the time they were written down.
Yeah.
You would say that's what I'd take the word canon to mean, but that's not. Do you mean that when Genesis was written, they believed it was historically, factually true?
That I don't know. There were probably some who did and probably some who didn't. I think it's impossible to be able to know what was actually in the minds of those people. But certainly when it became the Bible, there would have been some people who probably thought it was true. But I also equally suspect there were some people who didn't. I don't think there was a monopoly view at any point.
None of them were there. So if you take a 6 literal day creation seriously, even Adam and Eve weren't there for the first 5 days. So what sense it could possibly be history could at the very best only be word of mouth.
Some of it, yeah, but I believe that at least Genesis chapter 1 was basically dictated to Moses on Mount Sinai from God. That would be a pretty strong testimony.
I'd be interested in how that would get proved.
Well, you can't prove that, but you can't prove just about anything except in mathematics. That's not
okay, but
that's
now
not a standard.
Now we're just equivocating on the word proof. I think it's clear from the context what I mean by proof is to give some good evidence. So I don't mean proof in an axiomatic sense or in a geometric proof sense. What I mean is it would have to be demonstrated in some clear usual way that Moses heard from some God, and that what that God told him was, in fact, the way the events unfolded.
What would be your standards for discovering the accuracy of or inaccuracy of a historical document if it wasn't the Bible? How would you determine whether, some other ancient document was accurate or not? If it was a historical document, like what would be the evidences that you would accept as that this document is telling us accurately what happened?
History is hard. I think everybody acknowledges that. So for a historical document of an ancient age, it's extremely difficult to separate fact from fiction. And sometimes we just don't know. The obvious thing to do is you look for corroborative details. So if there's anything that's material that's being described, i.e. a location or circumstance, or even something astronomical that we can possibly rewind the movements of the stars to validate. So if there's anything like that we can use to try to place the time or the context, or maybe confirm some of those physical details or descriptions, we can try to do those. If it's in terms of actions of people, things that people did, sometimes they're just impossible to be able to validate. So we have to ask ourselves a question. If a human describes themselves running between two cities in half a day, and we see that those two cities are 50 or 70 miles apart, maybe that's a reasonable thing that could happen if it's a very fit person. But if it's something like somebody walked across the surface of a river to get to the other side and the river is a mile wide, then maybe we would challenge the truth behind that and think that maybe that's a bit of polemic, and maybe what actually happened is more mundane, and the retelling the story has been told a little bit more excitedly, so to speak.
I think it goes further. We are not actually talking about an event that is penetrable by history, because at least part of it happens prior to history. That would be some God's decision to create a universe. And no matter what you write in history, I don't see a way for history to confirm a breaking of natural law. For example, I could say right now that my daughter was kidnapped by aliens. You'd have nothing to go on to prove me wrong, except that it doesn't seem credulous to think that aliens kidnapped my child. I could very well believe it. I could report it as true. I could write about it. I might even have people around me who would support the idea. Why would I believe or disbelieve them and believe or disbelieve the Bible? Well, I disbelieve their alien stories because, as far as I can tell, there are no aliens to kidnap. And equally, as far as I can tell, there's no God that created the universe. I don't have any better evidence for the Christian God than I do for alien abduction. In fact, in some ways, alien abduction is more likely, but I disbelieve it for what I think are sound reasons. If you've got a God that wants me to believe that he created the universe, and you think he told that story to Moses, and you think the story to Moses was laid down correctly, he can solve this problem. It's pretty easy. He can just let us know.
Well, I would say he did let us know.
I don't know.
No.
That's what I'm telling you. And unless you think that I'm being dishonest.
I never said that.
No, there are presuppositionalists who will say that every human being has a God-shaped hole. Those people who disbelieve actually don't disbelieve. So I'm glad to hear you're not one of those, and I'm not making an accusation.
I do think that everyone makes a choice at some point in their life that is free. After you make that choice, you can program your brain to go through certain motions after that. I'm not big into presuppositionalism, but I do believe that there are I think it's Howard Schnellenberger's divine hiddenness argument. I don't think there are any non-resistant.
John Schellenberger, right.
Schellenberger. I don't think there are any non-resistant non-believers, in the sense that I think that everyone has made a choice to believe or not. This has come up before, so I would like to talk about this actually. Again, this is away from young earth creationism and stuff, but I think that there are basically two different ways of viewing the process of reason. And one of the ways is that reason is a source of knowledge, such that if you disagree with a rational conclusion, you are disagreeing with something that can only be one way, and therefore you're irrational. So in other words, if that view of reason is correct, there would only be one rational view, and all views that disagree with it are irrational by definition, because reason is a ultimate singular source of knowledge, such that it can only it can never disagree with itself, right? Then the other view, which is the view I tend to take, is that reason is a process of proceeding from premises to conclusions. And that means that the truth of your conclusions depends on the truth of your premises, even if you're reasoning correctly or validly. What that view allows me to take a position on is that you and I are both rational people, and we are correctly reasoning from our different premises to different conclusions. Our conclusions might both be valid, and our reasoning process might both be correct, but we have different premises. And whether you or I are correct is dependent upon the truth of our premises. And what I would say is I don't see a way for there to be a infinite regress of reasons. So I could keep asking why, like a 2-year-old. You never get to the bottom of that. There's got to be something that you ground your beliefs on. And I think that that's what I mean by basic values. And I think those basic values are a choice that we each make for ourselves. What do you think of that? Have you thought about reason as that way before, with two different conceptions of reason? Or which way do you think you would lean on that?
I tend to agree with you on that, Ben, in that the conclusions that we arrive at rationally are, the rationality of those conclusions is determined by the process that we lead up to it. That is separate to the accuracy of the reasons that we have. A child like myself, who was only ever taught Young Earth Creationism growing up at school before I was 10 years old, of course it was rational for me to believe in Young Earth Creationism at that point in my life, because everybody who I trusted who was teaching me stuff at school told me that that was the case. I had no basis on which to think otherwise. So of course my conclusion at that age was a rational conclusion. When I was an adult years later and I gained a greater understanding, I changed my view because of new information, and that also was a rational thing for me to do.
Okay, yeah, I can pretty much agree with that. Most people are rational people. I believe that most people know how to reason correctly and do most of the time. Not all the time, obviously, but I think most people are rational people. It really just depends on what information you're working off of. And also your basic values as well, which I think are choices.
There's something really interesting in there to me, that you think most people are rational. I think I also believe rational within certain limits. The world is pretty forgiving to a large degree. It seems very interesting to me to claim that we're all basically rational, and then to have, and this was a problem for me as a Christian, to then turn around and say, but we're also all broken, to the extent that we're sinners at some very fundamental level. So we're rational, but we're broken.
Yeah, so you're talking about the doctrine of original sin, or just that we're all sinners.
Right. So I was not a Calvinist, but I do understand I was more Armenian in my understanding. But for the purpose of this conversation, we can use Calvinism. It's perfectly fine. We can talk about it as original sin. That'll work fine for this conversation.
So Alvin Planting is famous for this argument about how our basic perceptions of the world are different if we're a Christian versus not, particularly our perceptions relating to God. Yeah, so I would actually probably share that concern, is that if we're basically broken in some way, that casts doubt on our actual perceptive faculties. So I would share that concern. I guess we'd have to parse out the difference between sin and being irrational. Sin can be rational. If your premise is, for example, self-interest, you can rationally do things that are in your own self-interest that are sinful. So I think there's a difference between sin and irrationality. So sin I define as a choice made against the will of God, or the commands, the will of God for us, right? Rationality is just rules of correctly drawing valid conclusions from premises. So if your premise is, I'm going to do something that is coming from a sinful desire, you can rationally do that. Looking at the world, it's hard to believe sometimes that we're all super rational people, right? And I say this myself all the time. I just sort of realize I don't want to contradict my own view, but people do form lots of irrational beliefs, I think. It's just that most of the choices that we make on a daily basis are, I think, rational. As in, I'm going to go to the sink and get a drink of water because I'm thirsty. That's a rational course of action, right? And you're saying there's a tension there with that and being broken in the Christian sense?
It's interesting maybe to say, okay, we can be basically rational, right? And that rationality somehow can walk us right away from the God that Christians propose. And so it very much seems to me that if there's a creator and framer of the universe, the man behind the curtains winding the clock gears, it seems very much to me like he would realize that a rationality that could walk a human being away from him would be incredibly self-defeating.
Yeah, it would be if you're going with the first definition of reason, where reason is an ultimate source of knowledge. I'm saying that your premises are where determine how you're going to end up if you're rational. So
Sure.
God didn't invent the premises which lead people away from Christianity or belief in him. He gave us evidences, I think. In the ultimate sense, I think we are making a choice. And I think the most important basic choice in your whole worldview is, do you believe in God or not? If you make that choice to believe in God, that is when you start reasoning, in my opinion. You can make arguments about consistency with other evidences, and that's what apologists do. But at the end of the day, I think it's a free choice. It's not based on reason so much.
So there's something interesting in there. You're talking about a choice to believe in God. I understand why you have this belief. I once shared it. It sounds like what you're saying is, oh, but you could just decide to believe. I don't think that is true on either model of rationality that you're proposing.
Okay. So, well, it would not be easy, but I think I would disagree. Yeah, I think you can do
But it wouldn't
that.
be rational. I mean,
Well,
no, it wouldn't be
so-
easy because it wouldn't be rational.
Okay, so what you're talking about is kind of the reverse method where you go from, so like, let's take a scientific theory. So an evidence for a scientific theory, right, would be something like you observe stellar parallax in distant stars.
Okay.
And that would be evidence for heliocentrism, for example, right? But you would never believe or understand stellar parallax to be for heliocentrism unless you first had a heliocentric model and understood what it meant and chose to interpret nature according to it. And then you would come to this conclusion that there should be stellar parallax if heliocentrism is true. And what you're saying, I think, is that if you don't observe stellar parallax, as it was not observed until the early 1800s, for example, then your conclusion should be that, well, maybe heliocentrism is false because we haven't made the observations that are consistent with it. That's scientific reasoning, and that's called inductive or abductive reasoning. And that is not 100% reliable, and in the way that I just described, because there was an ancient Greek named Aristarchus who was a heliocentrist, and he argued for this position, and all the other Greek astronomers said, well, we should see stellar parallax if heliocentrism is true, and we don't see it. And Aristarchus came back and said, well, the stars are just so far away that we can't see it. But that seemed to be like a rescue device to everybody, and no one accepted it. Okay, but it turns out Aristarchus was right. But it took over 2,000 years for us to observe stellar parallax because the instrumentation wasn't accurate enough to see it. There are situations, and there's no guarantee that we're not in a similar situation with other types of evidence, including scientific evidence today. We don't know what information we might be missing. And so scientific conclusions are not deductive conclusions.
Can I just quickly jump in here for the benefit of listeners who might not appreciate the terminology that's being used? So stellar parallax is where the Earth in its orbit around the sun moves such a distance through space that the angle that we see stars moves by a very tiny amount. So if you measure our vision of stars now, and then do the same again on the same stars in 6 months' time when the Earth is on the other side of its orbit from the sun, we've moved enough of a distance so you can see a very subtle shift between stars that are close together but quite long apart behind each other rather. You can actually detect a very subtle change in their position against each other. A bit like if you're looking at trees and you look through one eye at the trees and then through the other eye at the trees, you see the foreground tree move relative to the background. It's stellar parallax is the same, but with stars and 6 months apart.
And so, Ben, it sounds like what you're saying is that there's a benefit to lack of information, that what we should do, rather than withhold judgment on the things for which we don't have sufficient evidence, is just to believe whatever we have faith in and let that be the order of the day.
I'm saying you don't have a choice, because evidence is always underdeterminative. Because we don't have all the information, we can't know for certain what the correct conclusions are. And so we do, in reality, have to make a choice about what we believe. That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying we should not pursue more information. I don't agree with that. I think you said there was a benefit to having information. I don't think that. I think that we as human beings with finite minds and finite observational capacities don't have all the information.
I think the term finite is deliberately religiously loaded. We're here for a limited time and we have a limited capacity. But what you're saying is that our pursuit of knowledge, no matter how assiduously we attempt it, will never be able to trump this idea of faith that Christians have in a young earth. So it doesn't matter what work we do.
I didn't relate it to a young earth. I didn't relate it to Christianity even. I'm saying the process of reason, just the way we should correctly understand how reason works, depends on premises, some of which have to be choices, and we can't do it any other way. You have to choose even in mathematics, you have to choose a set of axioms on which to base your mathematical system. So there's the Euclidean one that we all know, but there are other mathematical systems that take different axioms, one of which was used by Einstein to describe what?
Non-Euclidean geometry is
so
Euclidean's obvious opposite.
Yeah. And so I'm saying that's the way it is with basically all knowledge, is that we have to take basic positions on certain things, like, for example, I trust the accuracy of my perceptions. Okay, we can't know that's true. We can't prove that's true. We can't prove that I'm not a brain in a vat and you're all part of a simulation or whatever. We can't prove that. There are lots of things we can't prove. But even non-Christians, and many non-Christians, we have to accept certain things as true in order to reason at all. And so I am saying, yes, that faith is the basis of reason, but that is necessarily the case for everyone. It's not just about Christianity. and certainly not just about a young Earth.
I kind of see where Ben is coming from on this, and yes, certainly in terms of the reality of the world we are and the physicality of the objects that we interact with, there are basic assumptions that we make in terms of our interaction with the real world. And yes, I'm okay with saying that is a form of faith. What I have a problem with is the actual use of the word faith in that context, because it feels, you'll have to forgive me, Ben, this is a feature of some of the kind of conversations I've had with Christians, specifically Christian apologists, is it feels like the use of the word faith there is a trap. And so I get very cautious. I'm almost allergic to the word faith. I have a similar feeling to the word belief. My experience of Christianity has poisoned the meaning of those words to such an extent that I almost break out in a cold sweat when you describe my experience of reality and my assumptions that I make about reality as a faith. My mind immediately tells me there's a trap coming.
That's fine. We can go with choice if you'd prefer.
Well, we don't make choices, so I don't think choice is the right word either.
Well, if you don't believe in it, that's fine, but it's a word that I'll use if you don't like the word faith, because that's basically what I mean by the word faith when I use it in that context, is that it's a choice.
One of the things that informs our choices is the reliability and reproducibility of the world around us. And so when you say, Andrew, you have faith that the food you bought from the grocery store, broadly speaking, is not going to poison you when you prepare it tonight. I'll absolutely agree, but that's not faith. It's not close to the idea of faith in some creator. What it is a reinforced idea based on reproducible circumstances. Now, I've had food poisoning. I'm not saying that the intuition is always correct, but it is not faith in the sense of Hebrews chapter 11, for instance, hoping the faith of the unseen, right? And so I think Matthew put his finger right on this. There's an equivocation on the word faith. And so when you say, I have as much faith in my worldview as the Christian has in their worldview, no, I don't. In fact, I'm very careful to say when I don't know the answer to something. So you might say, well, Andrew, how did the universe get here? Well, we've got some interesting ideas. I don't know in the end which will win out, but I have no reason to think that God did it. And so it is not the case that my trust in my ability to perceive the world around me is remotely the same as some kind of trust in a non-physical, all-powerful being that is beyond my grasp. We are simply not talking about faith in the same way.
Okay, would it be the same as believing in a unobservable theoretical material entity like an electron or a quark?
Electrons aren't theoretical in the same sense that, so I think we're going to end up equivocating on theory too, because the word electron is something given to a subatomic particle that we can actually manipulate, right? So we can see the result of electrons. Now, as it turns out, back in 2008, we were also able to manipulate a single electron and actually view an individual electron with a very high power microscope and a certain kind of needle and all of that sort of thing. So you say, so surely, Andrew, then what you could do is say that your faith in electrons, these things that you can't see, surely that is equivalent to the faith in a God that you used to have, even though you don't anymore. Were they equivalent at the time? That'd be a perfectly fair question. The answer is still no. Electrons, even though they're out of sight for us, do generate things that we can manipulate, and they are testable.
Ultimately, I think the existence of God is testable, and it will be testable to us when we die. So I am basic.
Well, go ahead. I call foul, but go ahead.
I mean, that's my basic point. I think that that I believe in Jesus Christ, that he died and rose again to save me from my sins. And I'm going to base my life on that. I choose to do that. And I will see whether that's true or not.
Or you won't.
Or I won't.
Because you see,
So
if the atheist is right, you absolutely won't see anything.
Yeah, you're right about that.
I'm not picking nits with you, though. I'm just saying that, in my view, your worldview didn't even allow you to come up with the idea that you might not experience anything, right?
No,
Although I
it's
think
true.
I think you would.
I immediately admitted that you're correct. I would say it's testable only if God actually does exist.
Right,
So
no, I completely accept
if he
it.
doesn't, then it's not testable in the sense that I would know the result of the test, right?
There's a difference between belief and knowledge, and what we've been trying to get to, I think, through this whole show, because we didn't do what we wanted to do, which was tackle young earth creationism, but all of this, you see, all of this is the foundation for why you accept young earth creationism and why Matthew and I do not. You accept that there is a God. I don't see any good reason to believe that. In my extended family, right here in my little corner of the Southeast, I have people that say they hear from God. Listeners here on Still Unbelievable have heard me say this before. There are no less than 4 conservative evangelical preachers in my extended family, Assembly of God and Church of God. These people think that they hear from God in their heads. I see no reason to believe them. And I see every reason to disbelieve them. And I see no reason to believe that there was a Moses that got the creation story right. And so before we can get to young earth creationism, we have to get to why that is a believable fact.
That's correct. You would have to accept the existence of God as a raw thing prior to some of the reasons that I have for young earth creationism. But if you maybe we can get to the science part of it. So Matthew, you mentioned going to the Grand Canyon.
I love that place. Second favorite place in the world. Yeah,
oh, it's amazing. I've been there twice, I think. Yeah, it's really cool. There is a geologist by the name of Tim Clarey who works at the Institute for Creation Research who has what I think is the best creation science theory of the formation of the Grand Canyon. And what I didn't know until I read him was that there's actually an uplift underneath the Grand Canyon. And this is one of the reasons why he argues that there was an uplift underneath it. So basically, the sediment, he thinks, was laid down during the flood and was soft at that point. And then after the flood, there was an uplift, which was essentially the same thing that caused the uplift of the Rocky Mountains, if I'm understanding him correctly. It's a feature of latent plate tectonics after the flood, where there was an uplift and it caused this soft sediment in that area to crack the way mud or wet sediment cracks when you move it. And then the water, some of the water drained off through those cracks, and that's what he thinks formed the Grand Canyon. And so he thinks that's consistent with all the layers being there and then rapidly carved out shortly after the flood.
Link 6 goes to an ICR article by Tim Clarey, which gives an overview of what Ben is referring to. And for balance, link 7 goes to a blog post by Professor of Geology Callum Bentley, expressing exasperation at Tim Clarey's idea.
You could look into that. I'm not a geologist, so I don't know the exact details of it, but in my opinion, Tim Clarey is the best creation geologist around.
I have 2 thoughts immediately onto that. I don't see how a flood could lay down that volume of material in that kind of layers, because the whole action of a flood would be a swirling mass. And so that kind of material would take time to settle. There would have to be very obvious demarcations of object size in order for that kind of layering to happen. I just don't see that mechanically. I think there'd be they would be much more mixed up than that. I really don't think that kind of clarity of layer is possible in a short flood format. Additionally, formation of that mud into rock, again, there just simply isn't enough time. I think that's a major problem for that. And then the other issue I have is the angled edges. So if mud's being swirled around by that, and if it's fully underwater, it would be flattened and rounded. You wouldn't have those sharp edges, which is a result of first erosion via water and then weathering by millions of years of wind and rain and salt and activity and stuff like that. So I just don't see how that kind of rigid layering can happen in a short form. So that, but I'll read this up, and as I said, link in the show notes to the gentleman that you've mentioned and that. So that's my initial thought on that, having not read any of the documentation that he's produced. It might be that he's addressed all of those in his documentation.
That would be a different issue than the Grand Canyon formation. Usually what I've seen from Clarey and other creation geologists is they argue that the distinctive sharp differences between the layers is evidence of less erosion over time, because erosion would create bumps and different things happening rather than a straight layer. So I wanted to briefly mention what is the current flood model, because there's a lot of young earth creationists at the lay level who hold to different flood models, but among the main young earth creationist organizations, I'm talking about AIG, CMI, Creation Ministries International, and ICR, the catastrophic plate tectonics model is dominant right now. And that is a view that the flood occurred in many different stages that started off with tsunamis. And this was a model developed by John Baumgartner in the early 80s, working at Los Alamos National Laboratory. And he used a computer program that he designed called Terra, which is still used in some climate models today. And it's fluid dynamics, and he used it to model the movements of the Earth's mantle, which basically behaves as a fluid. And so he had proposed that there's a mechanism called thermal runaway, which is a feature of the particular kind of rock that makes up the pre-flood crust. I don't know the technical term for it. When it's subducting, he calls it olivine. That makes it so that when it increases in heat and it has a whole bunch of shearing force on it, which is what happens when a plate is subducting underneath another plate, the crystal structure of the rock deforms, and that essentially means that as it gets hotter, it gets more dense, which is opposite of what you would expect, right? Like hot air balloons, for example, the air gets less dense when it gets hotter because it expands. But in this particular case, which is documented in the secular literature, it's a very difficult experiment to do because it requires very high heat and pressure, but it causes the rock to become more and more dense. And as it gets more dense, it drops further down in the Earth's gravitational field into the mantle, which causes more heat and shearing force. And so it creates this positive feedback mechanism that would subduct entire plates very rapidly. And what this does is it creates a whole bunch of tsunamis in a row that wash up on the shore of the pre-flood continental dry land, basically, and then recedes back again, and another tsunami comes and recedes, and another tsunami comes, recedes. And then eventually, once you get the whole plate subducted, the ocean floor actually rises because it's hotter than the plate that subducted. The plate that subducted is cooler, and the rock that's revealed is hotter. And so it rises the floor of the ocean and pushes the water up onto the continents. And that would oscillate because it happened rapidly. And so you get this after the tsunamis, which are caused the way we see tsunamis caused today by the catching mechanism of two plates rubbing against each other. After the plate subducts, there would be these oscillations of the ocean floors with the continents alternatively pushing the water up on the continent, going back down, bringing it back down, pushing it back up again. And this is the means of explaining in that model how you get all those layers. Now, I asked Clarey directly through email about the sediment transport issue, which you mentioned, which is still a valid objection to this model. And he didn't really have an answer to that. And he said, basically, I'm focusing on his work right now, which is he's building a model of the rock record over the whole Earth using oil well cores. And he comes from that industry, so he knows how to collect all those the core samples from oil wells. And so he's building a model of the entire rock record over the whole Earth right now. And so I think the sediment transport issue is a valid objection to that model that you mentioned. But there's a lot of reasons why creation scientists have accepted that model, and it seems to explain an awful lot that we do see, including the most dramatic example, which is a giant cold spot deep in the Earth's mantle that is difficult to explain on an old Earth view, because over time you would expect the temperature to equilibrate throughout the whole mantle. And so it's difficult to explain how there would be a giant cold spot on the order of 1,000 degrees cooler than the rest of the mantle. And I recently saw, I don't know if they're trying to explain this, I didn't look into it enough, but I recently saw a Science Direct article about a theory of an ancient planet crashing into the Earth, and so hard that it put stuff down into the mantle, and they were using it to explain a mantle abnormality, but I'm not sure if it's the same one or not. That's what I thought while you were talking about the Grand Canyon.
Yeah, so the subduction thing then you mentioned, so that would have to be rapid, because normal plate tectonics and subduction, we're talking a couple of centimeters a year is considered a very high rate of movement. So but you're talking something that would be in the order of meters per minute kind of movement, which is a massive differentiation in speed and movement.
Yeah, it's different than we observe today, that's for sure. So is, for example, a giant asteroid hitting the Yukatan Peninsula and wiping out the dinosaurs. That's also something we don't see today.
Yes, that's true. But with a giant asteroid striking the Earth, or even the used to be planet Theta, I think it was called, that crashed into the Earth, and then the accretion disk eventually formed the Moon. These are things that we can actually model, and things that we know happen. We've witnessed Schumacher-Levy 9 impact into Jupiter, so we can see these kinds of things happen, and we can see evidence of massive cratering on other bodies in our solar system. So we know that these things have happened. We have mechanisms of those things, and we can predict them and we can measure them.
The argument is that we don't observe asteroids that kick up enough dust into the sky that blot out the sun and cause mass extinction events. That's what we don't observe today.
No, because we know that they happen on an extremely rare basis. But the Schumacher-Levy 9 impact onto Jupiter was an enormous impact. And if that had hit Earth, that would have been catastrophic.
Sure. And that's one of the purposes of having massive gas giants in orbit farther out than the Earth, is to attract planetary or large bodies so that they hit those guys and not Earth.
Because of a benevolent creator, we don't need Skywatch. We don't need to track asteroids today.
That's not what I said.
Well, I am trying to understand what you said, and I'm not trying to be dismissive or pejorative. But you said that the purpose of these gas giants is to keep these asteroids from hitting Earth. And my point is that we have Skywatch, and that we are tracking asteroids that are Earth killer. And they're Earth killers because they're missing the gas giants. And so if the gas giants' purpose, as you said, was to keep asteroids from hitting Earth, they're failing in their purpose.
Of large enough to cause a mass extinction event. The reason we do astronomy.
I'm talking about Earth-killing asteroids that we are tracking.
We're getting distracted though. This point wasn't about asteroids. This was actually about plate tectonics.
What it was ultimately about is there's this long debate that I have gotten really tired of between catastrophism and uniformitarianism. And my position on that, so young Earth creationists say that they're catastrophists and that the assumption that they're fighting against is uniformitarianism, which is the idea that everything that has ever happened in natural history is just an extension of processes that we see occurring today. And they say that's a fundamental assumption of old Earth views. Meanwhile, they say that you should be accepting of catastrophes, things that are not the same as we see today that could have happened. And my frustration with that whole debate is that I see scientists on both sides I see uniformitarians using catastrophes to explain things, and I see creationists using logical extensions of processes that we see today into the past to explain things. I guess that's where I was coming from, was that there's this assumed difference between young earthers and old earthers about uniformitarianism and catastrophism, and I think that doesn't really describe the two views correctly anymore. And that was the reason I brought up the asteroid, is because there are supposedly uniformitarians who use catastrophes to explain things that happened in the past, just the same as young Earth creationists do. But anyway, before I finish, Tim Clarey has published some long technical articles on why he thinks the Yukatan strike in particular was not an asteroid strike, that I found interesting. Prior to him, most young Earth creationist geologists had accepted that it was an asteroid strike that occurred during the flood.
Link 8 goes to a short item by Tim Clarey on the Yukatan strike. Link 9 goes to an article where asteroid dust apparently confirms that the crater is from an asteroid impact.
The point that I wanted to get onto was, with asteroid impacts, we have direct evidence of them having happened, whereas for a massive change in the velocity of the rocks of tectonic plates, we don't have direct evidence of that actually happened, and we don't have a theory of a methodology by which that could happen. So I've got two issues. One, what evidence is there we can see of that actually happening, that enormous, massive rate of acceleration of the tectonic plates? What is the mechanism that could have driven that enormous acceleration?
I would simply say that we observe plate tectonics occurring. The difference is just the speed at which it occurs, and that's very similar to observing asteroids hitting the Earth. The difference is the size of the asteroid. Okay, it's a difference in degree, not in kind, and I don't think there's a difference there. That's why I brought that up. Okay. So evidence that we see, you asked about the mechanism. I mentioned that it's called thermal runaway, and that's from the secular literature, and I can send you the 1994 paper with Baumgartner, Snelling, Steve Austin is on there, that they did on this, and I think that has the reference to the secular literature on the process of thermal runaway. It's based on some experiments that were done in the 70s, I think. That's the mechanism, and it's just using the gravitational potential of the Earth itself to pull it down by changing densities.
I think Ben meant runaway subduction, not thermal runaway. See link 10 for a Wikipedia item on thermal runaway. This seems more appropriate to climate change than tectonic activity. More critically, thermal runaway is a known mechanism by which energy generated by a heating system creates yet more heat, and the process becomes cyclic. Runaway subduction is a phrase that seems to exist only in creationist literature, as a justification for explaining a global flood. I could find no reference to it in secular science, unlike thermal runaway. It appears that Ben has unfortunately got his terms confused. Link 11 goes to an article titled Runaway Subduction as the Driving Mechanism for the Genesis Flood, and appears to be the item that Ben is referring to. It looks like it is just a link back to an even older 1965 paper. Scientific knowledge on this subject has improved dramatically since 1965. Back then, plate tectonics wasn't even taught in schools. It was continental drift then. If this is what creation scientists are leaning back on, then they have an awful lot of catching up to do.
The other question you asked is evidence. Okay, so one of the more interesting, I gave evidence about the cold spot in the mantle, which we think is the pre-flood crust of the oceans. That's evidence. Another line of evidence is polarity reversals of the Earth's magnetic field. Now, this is a point that's accepted by both sides because we have evidence of magnetic materials in the ocean crust near the mid-Atlantic ridge where the plates are separating. And you see a striping pattern in the floor of the ocean, the ocean crust today, where it looks like the magnetic materials in the magma of the hot rock that comes up between the plates pulling apart. It's called sea spreading. They orient in one direction, and then as the rock cools, as it pulls away from the break point there, the rock cools and it hardens, and those magnetic materials lock into place. And then if a polarity reversal occurred, then the magnetic materials in the hot rock that is just coming out would point the opposite direction, and then those would then cool as they're pulling away. And you see this striping pattern in the ocean floor. Russell Humphreys is a contemporary of John Baumgartner, who came up with CPT. And he noted that if CPT were correct, that we should observe evidence of rapid polarity reversals in the Earth's crust, because he theorized that most of the reversals occurred during the flood. And he even came up with a mechanism by which the crust's pre-flood oceanic plates hitting or being near to the core of the Earth would cause polarity reversals. Now, I'm not aware of any other theory of why polarity reversals would even happen. And so he suggested one based on CPT, but he also suggested that would entail, as a prediction, evidence of rapid polarity reversals. And he suggested that it might be found in thin lava flows that are not that are not crust rock, right? So you might have a thin surface lava flow that cools much, much faster than the sea spreading crust at the bottom of the ocean. And if you could observe a striping pattern in these thin lava flows, that would be evidence of rapid polarity reversals. And as it turns out, some secular geologists found exactly the evidence that Humphreys predicted without knowing it and published it in the secular literature. They suggested these polarity reversals that they found in these thin lava flows, based on how fast they would calculate that the lava would cool, could have occurred in the space of a week, as little as a week, for a full polarity reversal of the Earth's magnetic field. Okay, and then after they found out that was a Young Earth Creationist prediction, one of the co-authors of that original study published a paper years later claiming that their methods weren't valid. And so there's a big argument about that. I can send you some articles on that as well. And I'm trying to find touch points where we can look at publications in the secular literature.
My memory of hearing about what Ben has just mentioned is that cooling lava flows are unreliable as a methodology, because it cannot be guaranteed that the magnetic alignments that are observed actually match the Earth's magnetic field, due to the movement of the lava and the rapidity of the cooling. I've looked into this a little bit, but the scientific material is large, and I could not find a summary that I felt I could add into the show notes. If you are an expert in this field, or know someone who is, please get in touch. I would love to have that conversation. reasonpress@gmail.com.
But I mean, what we're talking about here is science, correct?
Yes, it is. It's looking at evidence and trying to work out what this evidence actually indicates, and coming up with ways of being able to validate and test and explain what it is that we see, and in a hope of finding out a better version of the truth, to use a word that we were using earlier. You know, this is what we do. We look at evidence and we try to work out what reality left that evidence. And sometimes we'll land on the right answer, and sometimes we'll struggle around wrong answers until we get to the right answer.
It's not as if this idea that the Earth is 6,000 years old is common among the authorities. And none of us here are authorities in the things that we've been talking about for the last 15, 20 minutes. And so to then offer up a single authority and say, oh, well, this is what this authority thinks, is to sort of deceive the listener. And in order to avoid that, I am just going to point out that there are no experts in this panel on these subjects. But the age of the Earth is not a big controversy among most of the professional community. It's quite an unusual view among professional scientists. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't point out who disagrees. I don't have any problem with disagreement. But because there are no professionals here, if what the listeners have to go on is the consensus among professionals, the consensus among professionals is that the Earth is over 4 billion years old, not 6,000.
Yeah, I have no objection. That's the current consensus of most professional scientists.
Yeah.
And that is, I think, well, what a philosopher and an apologist would say, that's an argument from authority.
I was very careful to say that we should listen to both sides.
Okay, yeah, that's
but
fine.
The consensus is because none of us are professionals and because our listening audience is not professional. What they have to go on is not the argument from authority, but consensus among authorities.
Yeah, that's true.
And you offered Tim as an authority.
Philosophers of science have had a huge problem defining what science is. And I think that the consensus answer is that basically that what counts as currently scientific is determined by a consensus of experts in the field. Okay. Now, that's the only way to, I think, clearly define what science is. There was a lot of attempts to make definitions of what science is. One of the early attempts was something I heard one of you say earlier on, is that things can be verified by testing them or something. A century of philosophy of science, there is still no objective definition of science. And what we have is basically that. If you're not into the arguments yourself and you don't have expertise in the arena, in the field of study yourself, you just have to either be agnostic or go with some authority. And that's the only way you can really define what science is as a consensus of experts. What I would go further and say is that means unless you have an objective definition of what science is, and a consensus of experts is not objective, then you have to give up at least some of the authority of science itself as a claimant to truth.
None of us have access to seismometers, so we're not interpreting the raw data. However, we can all pick up a copy of Nature and understand whether the New Madrid fault line is more active now than it was during the previous periods it has been monitored. So the New Madrid fault runs from the Gulf of Mexico up into somewhere in Kansas, if I remember correctly. All right. So while we are not using seismometers or other fine scientific instruments because they're out of our grasp, we do have the capacity, if we're interested, to try to understand the literature and simply do better than a coin toss. And I don't think either one of us are proposing that we should toss a coin, right?
Correct.
And that is why understanding something about the consensus is important.
It's evidence, I would say, that is a legitimate position to take if it's the consensus in the field. I would agree with that.
Okay, good.
I'm not saying that science is a boogeyman. I got a science degree. I love science, and I read articles all the time. And
Sure.
As a layman with an undergraduate science degree, I can understand basic conclusions and basic evidences when I read papers in my field. Okay. But I'm not so confident that I could read a paper like you're talking about and understand the evidences that brought them to the conclusion that you mentioned. I'm not even sure that there are diagrams in Tim Clarey's recent book that I have that I don't understand how to interpret the diagrams. Okay. And I'm sure that there's at least some geology papers that have similar diagrams in them. There are certain things that require pretty extensive subject matter knowledge. But you're right in general. If I had some basic training and some basic understanding, I could read a scientific paper without myself being a working scientist or a PhD and basically understand it. And I do that pretty frequently, more frequently than an average person, not
Sure.
as frequently as a scientist. But so, I feel like when you said, maybe I'm misunderstanding you, you said something about a coin toss. And you said doing better than a coin toss,
Right.
as though. So I think were you commenting on my talk about making a choice, and were you equating a choice with a coin toss? Because I wouldn't do that.
No. Okay. That's a good question. You had said in response to me, if I recall correctly, the conversation's gone back and forth, and so now some of the nuance is being lost. But there is an idea that I thought you were promoting, that the non-technical person, the non-professional, because they can't understand the science, is just sort of making. So not you, not you, Ben, but the editorial you.
Okay.
The average pew packer out in the street.
I usually say pew sitters.
Fair enough. It fell apart when I had the pew sitters out in the street. So anyway, the average person that's trying to do what we're trying to do here, right? So the listeners, we're actually doing our level best to unpack some science, to unpack some philosophy, to unpack some religion. This is a tall order for anyone, right? But what I thought you were saying, possibly I completely misunderstood you. They sort of have to pick. And I think we can do better than just picking. Even for the average person, just reading the abstracts and the conclusions, I think they can do better than just making a choice. We can educate ourselves enough to have some understanding of why the consensus is what it is and why the disagreements are what they are. And so while we are never going to get our hands on the particle collider at CERN, it doesn't mean that we can't read and do better than a simple pick out of a hat. And I'm guessing you and I both agree there.
Yeah, and I would say that choice is not exclusive of having reasons. So you can consider evidence prior to making a choice, and people do that frequently. So I'm not saying you can't have reasons. I think that you do have some issues though if you're going to pick which authority, even within science, you have to pick which authority in time. So if you took the authority 1,000 years ago, that they would have said the Earth is at the center of the solar system.
Right.
And they would have said so with quite a bit of authority behind them and a model that worked pretty well, actually. We also have to consider future authorities when we're talking about science. There might be authorities in the future that have a different view than authorities today. And that is the main reason why I believe that the average pew sitter, so to speak, whether they're in church or not, puts a higher authority on the claims of the scientific consensus than is warranted. And that is an issue that has already come up in philosophy of science. It's been an issue for at least half a century. And most philosophers of science today, they have disagreements, but most of them accept the idea that most of our scientific theories are probably false ultimately as accurate descriptions of a reality. And you said approximations of truth earlier. That would be the scientific realist belief that theories may not be totally 100% correct descriptions of reality, but they are increasingly good approximations of truth. That would be one scientific realist view, for example. Sure. All I'm trying to do here is when I appeal to the authority of God or of the Bible, and you say, that's not certain, what are the reasons why I should believe that? Well, I have tons of reasons for that. It's not that I don't have any reasons. As a person who has examined the reasons for why we consider the Bible to be an accurate historical document, and there are, and I could give some if you want. As a person who has also studied the reasons why we would want to at least consider that the scientific consensus, the current one, is accurate and trustworthy, what I have found is that there is no conclusive argument, evidence, or sets of arguments or evidence that necessarily compel me, and I think anyone, to accept one or the other as correct about just about everything. And that is why I take the position that I do, is I think in the end, at the very deep bottom of everything, it's just going to be a choice at some point, because I don't think there's any way to prove one way or the other. I accept the Bible as my supreme authority because I think that's the word of God. And I think that God is omniscient and eternal, and he has made every observation from every possible angle that exists. And therefore, if such a God exists, he's the only one who could be absolutely right. He's the only one who could have the absolute truth. And I've chosen to trust that. That doesn't mean I have that truth. That doesn't mean I could know that. I'm just saying that if there is an absolute truth, I think that kind of a being is the only one who could know it. And I've chosen to trust him. And yes, I can't prove that beyond a shadow of a doubt. I think it's a choice. And I don't think that the typical view of the pew sitter or non-pew sitter, that scientific authorities have to be believed, is justified. It's not that I distrust science or I think science is a boogeyman or I think they're being dishonest. They're not. Young Earth creationists accept observations that are made about the world. There's a criticism of Young Earth creationism that's used all the time by the self-same pew sitters or non-pew sitters, that accepting Young Earth creationism means you have to reject chemistry, biology, physics, all of paleontology and everything else. That's just not true. And I knew that was not true growing up because I was presented all of this, and they would just say, well, we believe that there are these fossils of ancient humans that we found. We believe that there is such a thing as carbon-14 and a carbon-12 ratio, and that this in some cases gives accurate dates. We believe that there's such a thing as this, that, or the other thing about, radiometric dating or whatever. We just have a different interpretation of it, and we include in our reasoning evidence from the Bible because we believe that the Bible is a historical document, and historical documents should count as evidence when we're talking about historical events. So in the end, we're going to disagree, right? We may disagree. I'm just arguing that I don't believe my position is irrational, and I don't believe it's unscientific.
Concerning evidence, I think I can safely say one thing. I see no way for an account of history to demonstrate that some act broke the laws of nature. I'm not saying that those things don't exist. That is, that accounts of breaking the laws of nature don't exist. I'm not even saying that laws of nature are never broken, because I don't think I know what all the laws of nature are. First of all, is there a fifth force? I have no idea. Maybe there is, maybe there's not. You talked about historical documents as evidence. Well, I accept that there are historical documents that are evidence.
Like scientific papers.
Well, I'm not talking, so in this case, just pick an account of history like Caesar crossing the Rubicon.
How long ago does a document have to be written to be considered a historical document? That's an honest question. I don't know.
Oh, no, look, I get that because I had a similar question for you. And I think it's perfectly well phrased to point it back in the other direction. I think it's perfectly legitimate. I think of current events. I think of World War II as history. I think of the Vietnam War as history. Today, I probably even think of 9/11 as history. That all has to do with my personal makeup. Why do I think of it as history? Well, and where does the line occur for me? Well, history occurs for me when I have to go back and refresh my recollection about reported events. That's when it becomes history to me, when my personal memory of it is poor enough that I need to be refreshed before I feel comfortable talking about it. I don't think that's a great definition of history, but it's one that works.
That's subjective, but I think necessarily so. I don't know that there's an objective definition of what is history or not.
I don't either. When I think of something like Caesar crossing the Rubicon, crossing rivers is something that people do. I don't know that changing water to wine is something that people do. So my only point is this, there are certain kinds of claims in history that meet a threshold of evidence more easily than others. So what is that threshold of evidence? Well, for me, the things that I can believe. And so when you say some guy, not even talking about Jesus, so some guy was caught up on a chariot of fire and entered heaven. Okay, that's the kind of claim that you can write as fiction. It's the kind of claim that you can write as history, and I can't tell the difference. My challenge to you is to do better than just say God is a thing that you have to believe at the beginning. Because I think the default position for this kind of claim that the proposition has a true or false value, but that taking a position on that value, what you think it is, requires some kind of evidence. And for me, that kind of claim requires substantial evidence that doesn't exist. I'm not saying it can't exist. I'm saying I haven't seen it. And so for me, this whole conversation has been one where there are a lot of propositions. We both offered propositions that people should decide either true or false. But they shouldn't accept either one as true or false just as a matter of some base thing. Surely that's not how we make decisions. Surely we make decisions based on what experience tells us, not just, well, I picked one because it felt right.
Why do you believe in the existence of other minds beside yourself who is conscious and self-aware as you experience yourself to be your own consciousness?
The question is really one of hard solipsism, isn't it? I can't solve the hard solipsism problem. And I'm not claiming to be able to solve the hard solipsism problem.
But you do believe in the existence of other minds, right?
Well, yeah, I was going to answer you directly. So I can't solve the problem of hard solipsism. What I can say is that my response to the world around me and my observation of the responses of people around me have some overlap. We share very common responses. Now, there's the value meaning question in philosophy. I can't say for myself what Ben's values are. I can't say what's in your mind, but I can say that when you speak to me, there is your words have a set of meanings that I try to interpret. I guess I could think there are no other minds, but that doesn't seem to be parsimonious with my observations. And so when you ask, why do I believe in other minds? It's because it's parsimonious with what I observe. Why do you believe in other minds?
Because I think that it requires a free agent to create information, and I see other entities besides myself creating information all the time. That's what speaking is. Using language is creating information. And so for me, this is the design inference here. speaking, which was also a big influence on me growing up. For me, when you say that natural laws can't be broken, for example.
I said I didn't know if they could be.
You didn't know if they could be. Okay. Because you haven't observed an instance of it.
Not
Is
that I know
that
of.
right? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So the thing about information is that information is defined as the existence of contingency, meaning that it could have been other than what it was. And if you look into information theory, that goes back to Claude Shannon.
Comp sci is my thing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I forgot. Yeah. So
when you're talking about counterfactuals, that's a tricky landscape, because what you're arguing for is when you say something could be otherwise. There's checkers. If you and I were to play checkers, we'd have 4 men across the front, right? And those 4 men together could make 7 moves. If I'm visualizing the board properly, 3 of the men can make 2 moves, left or right, and the 4th can only make 1 move. That's into the corner. So I think that's 7 total moves if I'm visualizing the board correctly. But when I make a move, if you and I were to sit down and play checkers, those moves are open to me, those opening 7 moves, but I will only make 1. And so in that case, what you're actually trying to prove, and this is tricky ground, is that if I move the man into the corner, that at that same moment in time, I could have made some other choice. And so the landscape of counterfactuals is a very tricky one.
So my argument is that isn't the existence of information as a quantity dependent on there being an alternate possibility? So, for example, what about data compression? This is rudimentary. I'm not a computer scientist, but my understanding of how data compression works is that you expand the complexity of the code to include a larger number of possibilities. And that in turn means you can use the same basic physical representation of information to transmit a larger amount of information. And the only way you could have more information in the same physical space, so to speak, the same physical amount of data units, basic physical data units, is if there is such a thing as information that depends on there being alternate possibilities. What do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, although I think the original compression algorithms actually just did things like strip white space, but that's not what we're talking about. So I understand you. But again, you've run into the same problem. So we've got a friend of the show, Darren Lute, who famously talked about this. Well, I don't know if it's necessarily famous, but we certainly enjoyed the conversation. So you still would run into the question of whether the universe at that time and place could have been otherwise.
Yeah, I get your counterfactual objection. We can't know or prove that counterfactuals could have happened. Yeah.
That's all I'm saying. So I'm not disagreeing with anything else. In fact, I'm not even disagreeing.
Okay, but I think you have to assume that there could have been something other than what in fact occurred if the concept of information is to make sense at all. And all I was going for there, and you may have other objections, but all I was going for there is trying to connect it to our earlier question, is that if there is something truly contingent in nature that exists or that is real, like information, I think is real, that depends on the existence of actual possibilities being other. That means there's something that's not directly controlled by natural law, because I interpret natural law to mean the probability of the event described by the law is 1, meaning it couldn't have happened any other way. So the ball is going to roll down the hill if it has a force on it or whatever, all the given conditions, right? It's going to roll down the hill the way it's going to roll down the hill, and nothing's going to change that because there's laws in place that describe its behavior and oversee its behavior. If there is such a thing as genuine contingency or I guess you might say indeterminacy, which randomness and free will are both indeterminate causes, then there's something that's not prescribed by natural law. And I think that information in computer science is one of those things.
As far as I can tell, it is possible for information to exist independent of mind. And so I don't think that the sort of contingent relationship that I think you're talking about, if I understood you, I don't think information is contingent on mind in the way you suggest. We do a lot of boating. And right now, somewhere out on the lake close to us, 70,000 acres of water, there will be a part of that lake that is unobserved by any human being. And yet things are going on there as far as I can tell. Now, I'm not there to observe it, right? But
the moon is there even when I'm not looking at it, said Einstein.
Okay, well, I won't pretend to try to rise to the level of Einstein, so I'm going to leave that to you. But good quote. So here's one of the things that is all around this lake. There's a lot of submerged timber because when the Army Corps of Engineers built the lake, it flooded a bunch of stands of trees around the area, right? So if I got out there, in a couple of days and I see a tree limb or a twig or whatever in the water, and it wasn't, it's reasonable to conclude that information didn't come from a mind, right? It came from one of these flooded timberlands, and it didn't take observation to end up there.
You're talking about the specific course of a waterway, is that correct?
Well, sure. I mean, as an example, that is exactly what I'm talking about. The point is that it doesn't take a mind to have that information. If I understand you, what we're calling information is, any physical object can be reduced to what I think we're both talking about as information. Do I understand you there correctly?
Yeah, so I think what you're saying, sort of to drill it down, is that any physical particle could have been in any other place than it was without a mind intervening?
Well, almost. So that's really close, but not exactly. My point is that you talked about a ball rolling downhill, right? And I agree that it will take the path that it takes based on whatever the physical constants are around it. Okay. My point is that all of that can happen independent of mind. That a mind isn't actually necessary for information. And so if I understand you, and I'm not positive I did, but if I understood you, you think of information as contingent on mind, and I think that mind ultimately would be God. And I don't see it at all that way. As far as I can tell, information is not mind contingent. And that may be the heart of part of our disagreement.
I would say that I think information is evidence of some kind of indeterminate process. So it could just be randomness. Random is indeterminate, and also free will is ultimately indeterminate as well, though free will can take stock of reasons and evidences as well, but ultimately it's an indeterminate choice. So information sort of can be in the Shannon sense. Shannon information can be generated by random processes. So the intelligent design argument goes further than that and says, yes, but if it matches Dembski's original phrasing was independent pattern, then you can infer intelligence. He's adjusted it since then. But so I guess what I was trying to get at is, do you believe in a physical determinism, that there is 100% from the very beginning initial conditions, whatever you think those are, everything has played out in exactly the way that it has and could not have been otherwise in any way? That would be like physical determinism.
Right. Now we're into A theory, B theory of time, and all of that sort of thing. Matthew, I promise not to do that to listeners, and I'm about to give you the last word.
Okay.
I don't have a thought on A theory, B theory. I just read an interesting. Sorry, go ahead. You were going to say.
I don't know why that has to do with A theory or B theory, Can you explain that real quick?
Well, yeah, as far as I understand, the total physical determinism is one of those, is implied by I don't remember whether it's A theory or B theory, but the other does not imply total physical determinism. I will only say this. So you said, do I believe in? That's not language that I use. This is another element of how we come to disagree.
Saying that total determinism is true is just the same thing as saying its opposite is false, right?
But what you're asking me to do is take a position on truth or falsity when all I can observe is the kind of thing that we've already talked about. At any moment in time, I only live one future. And we're back into counterfactuals again. I don't have any reason to think, and my observations lead me to conclude that total physical determinism is a reasonable conclusion.
Do you say you don't have any reason to conclude that it is a reasonable conclusion?
I don't have any reason to conclude that it is not reasonable. Let me just put it in the affirmative. I think it's a completely reasonable conclusion to draw. Do I believe in it? I don't talk about belief in the way you do. When you say believe, I hear knowledge, and maybe that's not what I should hear.
You should hear choice.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. So do I have a choice to think that the world is other than entirely physically determined? I don't see any evidence for that.
If you could choose to believe that it's not physically determined, then that would be sort of accepting that you have a choice, right?
Can I turn this around, Ben? Could you choose to believe that God is a fiction of your imagination?
Yeah, I think I could.
Wow, didn't expect that.
I think it would be more difficult for me now to do that than it was when I was younger. That's because I think there's a thing called instantiated choice, where we sort of, when we make a choice, it sort of structures our mental life around that choice, and it becomes easier and easier to make the same choice in the future. Sort of like addictions, right? So
you're describing something that's deterministic.
I don't think addictions are choices. I think they're compulsions, but I understand. I'm not picking at the example. I understand the idea.
It's like programming a computer, all right? I think your brain is essentially vaguely resembling a computer enough to say that we can, as our spiritual component that I believe in, I'm a substance dualist, that is the source of our ability to freely choose. And we can make a choice and then write it sort of in our brain as like a program. And so I think this may not be relevant, but I think it would be harder for me because of my history of making the choice to believe in God. But I think I could make the choice not to, yeah.
I have to be honest, you've lost me in that train of thought, because as a software developer, the computers operating the software that I write don't have a choice.
But programmers do.
No, because my brain's the same. It's an information processing unit. Information comes in, and then the body responds to what the information indicates that it should do. And it's exactly the same way with the computer program. So the software that I do is given information, and it responds in the only way possible according to the information and the inputs it's given at that point in time.
So do you believe that when you write a program, that program was destined to occur from the beginning of the universe?
Like Andrew, believe is the wrong word to choose. I accept that is very likely the case, yes.
Okay. That's total physical determinism. So that's why I'm trying to understand. So yeah, okay. So if there were anything that could have been otherwise, which you can't prove, then that would violate total physical determinism. And I think information is evidence that there is such a thing as alternate possibilities. That was all I was trying to say there.
Maybe that's part of the heart of the disagreement. What ultimately boils down to libertarian free will.
It's a very basic assumption that I make in all of my thinking. Yeah.
Well, 3 hours in, we've gotten to libertarian free will. Congratulations. This is not the show I expected. I have 4 pages of notes, Ben, from your second podcast.
Sorry.
Yeah, well,
My fault.
sorry, listeners, you've got something completely different. If you want Ben back again to talk more technical about young Earth creationism, what he actually believes, what it entails, the usual email address, reasonpress@gmail.com, because we are not going to get into any detail about that now. I may just throw a few quick fire questions at Ben just to get some kind of picture, because I've been dying to do that all evening. But it's been a while since Andrew and I have had a good chinwag about stuff, and we get into this kind of stuff quite often. I hope you appreciated it, listeners. reasonpress@gmail.com if you did not, and we will change the subjects that we decide to talk about. But please do give us some feedback. But what I would like to get on to, Ben, is just a few quick fire things, and there is your second question. All this came from your very first question. Your second question to me, and I think it's really important that I actually answer this question, not just for you, but for Christians who will end up listening to this as well. And congratulations, Christians, if you've got to this far. The second question you asked me was about the appearance, the apparentness that I come across as an angry atheist or angry at young Earth creationism explicitly, and where does that anger come from? And I think that's a very fair question. You're not the first person to suggest to me that I come across as angry. Others have done the same. And all I can do is say just straight out, sorry people if I sound angry. Sometimes my enthusiasm gets the better of me, and I let my enthusiasm explode into a different tone of voice, and it comes across angry. Sometimes I get really enthusiastic and passionate about something, and it comes across as angry. Yes, sometimes I do get angry at Christianity, and sometimes I do get angry at young Earth creationism. Usually that's because when I see something that's an injustice. One thing that I specifically get very angry about is when I look into the deconstruction Facebook groups and other social media groups that I'm at, and I see people who are coming into the group freshly questioning their Christianity, and they're absolutely rammed full of religious trauma. That makes me angry. I get angry on behalf of them. I get angry at the infrastructure that has created the trauma for them. And this isn't specifically aimed at young Earth creationism. In fact, I don't think young Earth creationism is necessarily even a feature of that. But that's the sort of thing that makes me angry. And sometimes I get so indignantly angry that I want to shout at Christians on their behalf. So yes, sometimes I'm angry, but I try not to give across too much an expression of anger, because I think when I'm on a podcast like this, unless my anger is focused, I think it's unproductive. So I will try to tone that down if I'm coming out across too much of anger. Usual email address, usual place for feedback. If you think, Ben, there's a point that I come across too angry, my apologies if that is the case.
My problem with YEC, I had to own up to some anger, bitter anger. I live in the American South, and the people that promote young Earth creationism here are also the people that don't seem to care about the environment. There's a high correlation with heavy gun ownership. And Ben, I don't see any of that. But there's a branch of young Earth creationism that is completely anti-science. They're science phobic. And it's worse than that. These are people who, this world is not my home, I'm just passing through, and they don't seem to care about the world around them that they live in. Yes, I am angry at them. I am bitterly angry. For those young Earth creationists that aren't that, I'm not mad at you. For those young Earth creationists that are, you're right in my sights. I'm talking to you.
Okay, well, I would just say briefly that believing that God created the earth means that you think nature is God's artwork. And there would be the same reason for preserving that as there is for preserving the Mona Lisa.
I would have agreed with you when I was a YEC. We would have gotten along there. So thank you. Do you know that there's a radical version of YEC that sees things in a very different light? Are you ever even exposed to that?
Me personally, growing up, the story that I hear from most people who are in your position is that when you were young, or even as you grew older and began asking tough questions because you're intelligent, everyone asks questions.
Thank you. You're the only guest to ever say that. You have my eternal gratitude.
Yeah, and the issue often is that when intelligent young Christians grow up and ask tough questions, they get answers from people who they trust and who are in authority to say, well, you just need to believe it, and you just need to trust the Bible, and are you doubting the Christian faith? And it becomes not what it was intended as a question of intellectual desire to know more. It becomes the authority doesn't know the answer and probably hasn't thought about it themselves, and so they get angry and say, don't understand the question, and say, you just need to believe it. Okay, I did not have that experience growing up. My dad was a doctor, an MD, and he was deep into this stuff. Whenever I had a tough question for him, he always gave me an answer. Now, sometimes off the cuff, it wasn't the best answer. He's not perfect, but he never said to me that I can recall, you have to just believe this because I told you to. And when I listen to some of the deconstruction podcasts, I listen to Lisa Childers a little bit. They talk about that same thing where when a kid has a question, you need to treat it seriously. And if you don't know the answer, just say you don't know. And I feel like that is a problem in the church. I didn't personally experience that. I grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska, but maybe it was just the people I was around, my dad especially. I don't know. So I didn't experience that. But I know a lot of people have, and I know that does exist. For me, I never thought much about that because maybe it didn't emotionally affect me probably as much. But logically, I was like, Christians have always admitted that we are also sinful and we do things that are wrong. I don't want to be heavy-handed here, but I'm just saying that that's not evidence of anything either way, is how people behave. People can behave differently, and Christians can behave poorly. That's not something that I want to base my worldview on, is based on someone else's behavior. At the same time, I recognize that I didn't have that experience, and that might be one of the reasons why I did not leave that community growing up.
Right. No, that's fairly said. My reason for leaving wasn't because I was mad at bad young Earth creationists, but I do have some anger today toward bad young Earth creationists. They're two different issues.
Okay,
I walked away because I don't think the evidence supports young Earth. Hopefully that was understood.
That's fair.
The show, right? But yeah, I accept that it could come across the other way. Maybe there are people out there that think Matthew and I both walked away because we're mad at bad Christians. I'm mad at bad Christians. That's not why I walked away.
Yeah, that's fair. I shouldn't have suggested that. But yeah, you're right. I have had people tell me before the same thing you guys did, that you're one of the good ones, even though we don't agree with you, So.
Well, I think we both say that and mean it genuinely. So hopefully it doesn't seem diminutive.
So if I could add one thing to that, I thought a lot about this, as you might imagine. And I think one of the reasons why that phenomenon exists is because our point of view is excluded from institutions. And that's not just saying that we're an out group and we're bitter about it, though there is some of that. It also means that people like me are not given platforms of credibility where we can teach a good version of our position to even our own people. And so young Earth creationists are in the position where they can't go to college and learn their view. And so they are forced in their minds to choose between the Bible and science. And if young Earth creationism was more accepted as a position that was allowed to participate in the conversation, you would have young Earth creationists, you would have more of them who are like me, is what I'm saying.
Ben, I am going to thank you here. I hope you will come back. It was a pleasure, truly, getting to talk to you. You clearly have thought about your own worldview. It was a show I would happily do again. Matthew, it's all yours to the end.
Yeah, for sure. I would just say feelings mutual. I enjoyed it, and I would happily come back on again. You guys are pretty cool in person.
Thank you, Ben. I genuinely appreciate that. I'll be honest, I was nervous about how we would manage this conversation, but it's gone not only in a different direction to what I expected, but it's been much more pleasant than I anticipated, and all that I feared has not been there at all. So thank you. That's been great, and I think it helps both sides to be able to manage that, even if sometimes I am an angry atheist. I was going to ask you just little questions about, things like, do you believe the universe is also young like the world, and about the formation of fossils and the formation of oil, and how we have light from billions. But I just don't think any of that's relevant, and it'll add another 20 minutes. And I think if you're going to come back, we should save all of that for when you come back, which really only leaves the final question, which we gave you forewarning about, was, do you have a favorite Bible character, and would you like to tell us about them?
Sure. And I would just also want to, in addition to thanking you guys, I want to thank God, because I asked him that our conversation would be good today. And I believe that he does exist and is living and active in the world, even in atheist lives. So my current answer to my favorite Bible character is probably Jeremiah. I've been reading in Jeremiah recently. I'm a fan of The Chosen, which is a TV series about Jesus. And I've often hoped and desired that after they're done with Jesus's life, they should do a movie or show on the life of Jeremiah. There's some things I identify with Jeremiah. Again, Jeremiah was called to be a prophet when he was really young. Not that I'm claiming to be, I'm not a prophet. I guess that's not me identifying with him. It's just he was a young person who was called by God to go and speak to a bunch of people with way more authority and power and experience and knowledge than him. And he basically was told sort of by God that they're not going to listen to you, but I need you to go and tell them anyway. And his life story is pretty interesting. At one point, people got so angry at him because the message he was supposed to preach to them was that you guys are going to be conquered by Babylon, and that he was predicting the Babylonian exile. And there were a bunch of false prophets around that were telling everybody what their itching ears want to hear. They're saying, no, we're going to beat Babylon, everything's going to be fine. And Jeremiah was the lone voice saying, nope, you're going to get conquered by Babylon and taken away. And at one point he was thrown in a cistern, a water collection device where there's mud at the bottom, and left to die because of that. Just sort of the lone voice trying to convince people of something that he ultimately failed to convince them to do or to believe. And yet he was still doing God's will and being faithful to what God asked him to do, even though the message was not well received. And then at the end of his life, Jeremiah was in this weird position where over and over he had told the Jews that remained I think I need to study more on the timeline and all the stuff that happened, but my understanding is there were Jews that remained or in Israel or something after the exile. I'm probably misstating it, but anyway, there's some point at which God tells him that the Jews that remain are considering going to Egypt, and God says, tell them not to do that. Don't go to Egypt. And once again, Jeremiah tells them, don't go to Egypt, and they go to Egypt. At that point, Jeremiah has this conundrum where God, you told us to stay here, but they didn't listen. They're going to Egypt, and these are my people. Should I go with them? And God says, it's okay. Go with them, He wanted Jeremiah to have a life after that. Wow, I didn't expect. I don't know why that hits me so hard. Anyway, that's my answer.
Thank you, Ben. My memory of Jeremiah is quite poor, so I haven't got a relevant question to ask you on that, but thank you for that. And with that, Thank you again, Ben. Welcome back anytime. Thank you, Angie, for joining me on this day deeply. And until next time, stay reasonable.
All right, thank you.
You have been listening to a podcast from Reason Press. Do you have any thoughts on what you've just heard? Do you have a topic that you would like us to cover? Please send all feedback to reasonpress@gmail.com. You might even appear on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. To hear more of her music, see the links in our show notes.